There's something about the forest that intrigues me, and if you enjoy the outdoors, it's likely that you understand what I mean. For many, the forest symbolizes freedom, adventure, and an escape from society. But what happens when we realize that we might not be the only ones that use the forest to hide? A couple of today's listeners have experienced just that, and it's a sobering reminder that we should never underestimate the world around us.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you for being here. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. As always, I'd like to start out the show by saying a huge thank you to our wonderful patrons: Robin, Cassandra, Juli, Kortnie, Tiffany, Stephen, Mystica, Carley, Kyriakos, Euknecka, Mary, Andrew, Sarah, Angie, and our 2 newest patrons, Nick and James. Your support and generosity is truly amazing, and it makes our podcast possible. Thank you. Our first story of the night comes from Anisha. Anisha says, "Hi, I am from India, and I wanted to share my story with you. I hope you are all doing well during this crisis. I have always been fascinated with the paranormal. I have read books, watched horror movies, and even read articles on the internet. I love reading about haunted houses and watching people visit these places. I had just started my first year of med school in a really old but pristine medical school in Delhi. It had been started by the British in 1914 and has been standing there since. I was living in the college hostel, and at that time rooms were on a sharing basis. I stayed with 2 other girls who became my best friends. Now, the layout is a little important. 2 rooms are connected by a small hall behind the rooms, which lead to a bathroom and a toilet. So there were 6 people to 1 bathroom and toilet, and we have a long corridor near the stairs in front. My room was on the 2nd floor. Many of us had come down with the flu, and I had been one of the very few who had not yet contracted it. I had been unable to sleep that night, and had started to count sheep. The corridor in front was lit up, and I noticed a shadow. Thinking that it was my friend, I sat up and was about to call her in when I realized this shadow was a proper figure, standing in the middle of the corridor, not a 2D shadow on the wall or it being anyone else. I looked through the window as a cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and I was frightened. It was a shadow figure. I dived into the sheets and shut my eyes, chanting St. Michael's prayer. I was so shocked, I developed a high fever the very next morning. Many of my friends dismissed my tale, saying that the fever had made me imagine things, not the other way around. I was pretty upset that no one believed me. 3 to 4 days later, my friend told me that she saw the figure in the adjoining room. She had been keeping our sick friends company when she woke up for no reason. Confused and disoriented, she saw a figure near the door. It was dark, and yet this figure was visible, and its shape was clear. "Why are you here? How did you get in?" my best friend had asked, disoriented when she realized that this thing had no face or any feature other than being a shadow. She told me that she was horrified as she watched this thing slide toward the back door and rematerialize in front of the front door. She remembered what I had seen and quickly shut her eyes, praying. Soon enough, many others in the hostel began to see this figure, but later dismissed it, saying they were influenced by my tales. However, to this day, me and my best friend know that we saw something not of this world, and we did not conjure it from our imaginations. We still talk about it, trying to figure out what it was. It was quite an old college and hospital, so maybe spirits were kind of a common place. We always had this strange phenomenon, where all the dogs, we had a ton of stray dogs in the Indian college, would howl at exactly 2 a.m. in the night, every night. I hope that my experience will help others to open up about theirs. Have a good day, and be safe. Our next story of the night comes from Jordan. Jordan calls their story, Top Hat Man. Jordan says, "Hey Nick, love listening to your podcast at work and figured I'd share my own story with you. When I was 13 years old, I was in my bedroom at my computer desk one night doing homework. My desk was in a position to where when I'm sitting down, my back is toward the door. After a while, I became thirsty and decided to get up for a drink. I swung around in my chair and instantly froze when 4 feet in front of me was the silhouette of a tall man wearing what seemed to be a cloak and a very tall top hat. He literally looked like Abraham Lincoln would have looked in person. Well, this guy wasn't just standing there. When I swung around and laid eyes on him, he froze at the same time that I did, arms in stride, and giving me a side look like I had just turned around and caught him, trying to sneak around me without noticing. Obviously, at first, I was very frightened, but after an hour or so had passed, my thoughts about what I had seen changed from scared to very intrigued. I actually thought that what I had just seen was really cool, after realizing that I had felt no negative or unsettling feelings towards the matter. For years to come after that, I've had many things paranormal happen to me, but nothing as interesting as the Top Hat Man. Skipping 2 years later, my grandfather, who I was very close to, became old in age, and eventually was put in a nursing home. One day while visiting, I found that he had told one of my aunts that he didn't really want to go home until the man was out of the house. Well, that's a little freaky, I laughed to myself, without even giving it a thought. Well, after a few months, it became my grandfather's time, and he passed on the day that they were actually going to get him home, so that he could live the remainder of his time there. After the funeral, the family closest to him went to his house to do the usual eat and remember good times. This is where it gets weird. Besides my brother and a few close friends, I had never mentioned what I had seen in my room all those years ago. Me, my brother, and all of my aunts are watching a slideshow of memories of my grandfather, when one of the sisters gives a little laugh and says, "Remember the ghost that used to live here with us?" Her sister replies, "Yeah, the guy with the top hat that we always used to see." Needless to say, I turned to look at my brother and meet his shocked expression. I started laughing and told my aunts, "If that isn't proof that the paranormal/supernatural is real, then I don't know what is." A little background to this story, just so you can understand. I used to stay with my grandparents over the weekends. My grandfather had been in World War II and often sent me home with things I showed interest in, such as a pocket watch, old metal cigarette holder, and cool things like that. Why the Top Hat Man decided to pay me a visit in my own house, I have no idea, especially since I used to stay the weekends with them every week and had not witnessed a single paranormal encounter over a span of so many years. Our next story of the evening comes from Trinity. Trinity's story is called An Encounter I Had at My Grandmother's House. Trinity says, "My grandmother lives in the woods, around a small town in the countryside, a couple minutes' drive from my own house. We spent a lot of time at my grandma's house, my siblings and I. I'm normally out all day and go inside after the sun goes down. It's not because of cougars that might live up there, or the hordes of coyotes that take down large animals. It's because every couple of months, something strange happens. I am a pacer. I walk around a lot, so sometimes I pace in my grandma's driveway, not too far from the house. My grandpa always has his porch light on after a certain time of day, and that illuminates the driveway, but that's about it. The woods around their home are concealed in shadows. I have pretty good night vision, and I think that's the only way I was able to see what I saw. In the shadows was one of my friends, who lives an hour away from my house. There wasn't any way that she could get there, since she can't traverse long distances that easily. I just saw her lower half, but it was enough. My gut was telling me that it wasn't her, and when my legs worked again, I ran to the porch. She followed me so silently that I didn't notice her until I looked over my shoulder. She was looming in the shadows, at an angle where I could see her body but not her face. I didn't go outside the rest of the night. The same thing happened a couple of months later, when I was out back. It was broad daylight outside when I saw my other friend running through the woods. She lives just across the street from my grandma's, so naturally I thought she was playing a joke on me. I texted her asking if she had gotten home early from church, since it was only 11 in the morning. She told me that she wouldn't be back until 2 p.m. I followed my gut and stayed away from the wooded area for the rest of the afternoon. I have other paranormal stories. This one is just the shortest one. Thank you so much for reading and listening. Trinity. Our next story of the night comes from Myra. I read one of Myra's stories in our last episode, and after telling me about another of her paranormal experiences in the Cheyenne area, I just had to share it with all of you. Myra says, Cheyenne started in the 1800s, and I have stories about one of the first hotels and one of the first theaters. Because the stories about the theater are longer, I'll share those first. For a while in high school, I didn't really believe in ghosts until that night in my room with the little girl. Even after that event, the paranormal wasn't very prominent in my life, not as much as it is now. After I graduated, my mom gave me and my best friend tickets to a comedy show at a place called the Atlas Theater. I had known some of the history of the Atlas Theater since I was in high school. I knew there was a lady in white who haunted the stairwell, and a few children spirits who moved things around, jokingly. That I know of, there is only one malevolent spirit who had lost his family and now haunts one of the rooms upstairs. This particular evening, my friend and I decided that we would sit in the balcony to watch the show. He knew that it was haunted, but was still a bit of a skeptic. Halfway through the main comedian's routine, I began to feel tired and almost like my head and body were filled with bricks. I wasn't laughing at anything, and the comedian's words were muffled almost. After about 2 minutes or so, I snapped out of it, sat up in my chair, and was able to pay attention to the show. That night I felt fine, aside from a deep pain in the back of my head, an occurrence I would later find happens when I deal with strong spirits. A couple of weeks later, my friend came forward about his experience that night. Do you remember anything about what you said that night, during the show? He asked. From what I recall, I was as respectful as possible and tried to keep my talking to a minimum. I asked him what he was talking about, to which he said, About halfway through the main comedian guy, you turned to me and said, Isn't this a great show, honey? I was horrified. I do not remember saying anything like that to my friend, and I certainly have never called him honey. After a few weeks, I figured the feeling of being weighted down and unable to move was the feeling of possession by the spirit, something I would learn is fairly common. With spirits, they don't commonly stick around to their host like demons would. I had no other explanation for what had happened. When I was in my 20s, I had embraced my gift, and I was able to communicate with spirits. I had began to dabble more into the paranormal, visiting locations I knew were haunted to test my abilities. Having spirits come through to me was so exciting. My other friend knew about it and embraced it. For this story, I'll call her Sarah. Sarah and I were going to a screening of Night of the Living Dead at the Atlas Theater. I had told her about my experience before we went in. She had made the decision to sit in the balcony, in the exact spots where my friend and I had sat during the comedy show 5 years prior. The only difference is that she sat where I did. Throughout the movie, I kept feeling something come between us. This was more than my sixth sense. This felt dark. Out of concern, I would consistently turn to my friend and ask her if she was okay. She responded every time that she was, until we were about halfway through the movie. The feeling of darkness and something between us got too strong. I turned to her to see her staring at me. Sarah, I said, are you okay? She only smiled as if she was high. Sarah? I asked again, this time touching her arm. At that point, she snapped out of it, lost the goofy smile, and just looked at me. "You good?" I asked. She held up her right arm and said, "My arm hurts." We left the balcony to step out into a lighted area so I could check and make sure that she was okay. On the back of her arm, it looked as if she had been pinched. She was pinched hard enough to bruise it immediately. Where the bruise was, it would have been impossible for her arm to have been caught in the theater seat, or for her to have pinched it herself. She took a moment to collect herself, and we went back inside. As we were starting Dawn of the Dead, we were talking about what had just happened. She was anxious. I consistently felt like something was watching me. I kept turning around to look toward the sound box. There was nothing there that I could see. My friend and I remained quiet for a bit when we heard a seat creak down and then slam back up. This was right behind us, where no one was sitting. We did not stick around for the rest of the movie, because it felt like the thing did not want us there anymore. I apologize for this being so long. As I said before, I have many stories. Not all of them take place in Cheyenne, but they all involve ghosts in old places. I love telling all these stories, and I'm glad to have a platform to share these. Thank you for all you do, Myra. Our next story of the night comes from Vanessa. Vanessa's story is called Possessed. Vanessa says, "Hi, Nick. I found your podcast months ago, and I appreciate your time and dedication sharing the stories from others regarding the unknown. I have been debating sharing this story because I am worried that it's going to sound very cliché, but this happened in my house my sophomore year in high school, which was sometime in 2004. I apologize if this is long. I grew up with my parents and my brother, who is 6 years older than me, in Arizona. We lived in a 2-story house, which my brother and I had rooms upstairs. One night as I was sleeping in my bed, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from downstairs. I woke up and paused as I sat up in bed, wondering what and where the scream was coming from. After a few minutes had passed, I realized that it was my mom, and it was coming from downstairs. I jolted up and ran into my brother's room and woke him up and asked him as he sat up, "What is that?" He then jumped out of bed and ran downstairs, and I followed, because at least I was not going alone. When we made it into the kitchen, I saw my mom on the recliner in the family room and my dad holding her down onto the chair. She was still screaming and her eyes were open, but they were all black. Her body was all stiff, and she just kept screaming, and almost like she was looking around, but was not aware of what was going on. I was so scared and had to leave the room. My grandma was there, and she was very religious and holding the rosary and saying prayers as she walked back and forth. I remember hearing my dad repeating to my mom, "It's okay, stop screaming." As I ran upstairs, I tried to call my boyfriend at the time, who did not answer after repeated calls. This all felt so unreal. After a few minutes, I did not hear the screaming anymore, and I went halfway down the steps, where my brother and grandma were standing by the door. I don't remember what exactly my brother said, but it was something along the lines of "there is something in the house, and he is going to open the front door." Keep in mind, at this point, the screaming had stopped. My grandma yelled at him and told him that if he opened the door, he was going to let whatever affected my mom back in the house. My brother did it anyway. Nothing really happened once the door was open, and my mom at this point was up and walked into the room by the front door. She looked like a zombie and was very catatonic. She sat on the couch by the front door and just stared in silence. I was still terrified. A few days later, we talked to my mom and asked her if she was okay, and she was confused to why we were asking that, because she did not know what had happened. She shared that she felt like she had got thrown out of bed. She had no recollection of screaming or talking to us during this event to try and get her out of it. I remember for a few weeks, I was afraid to be at home with my mom because I had no idea what was going to happen, and I feared I was going to be able to fight whatever that was if it came back. To this day, my mom does not recall anything, but it was very real for my brother, my dad, my grandma, and I. Thanks for all you do and choosing to read my story. Our next story of the night comes from Maddie. Maddie's story is called Newfoundland Bigfoot. Maddie says, "Hey Nick, First of all, I live in Newfoundland, Canada, and being in such a province, it's completely soaked in paranormal history and stories and folklore, and there is no shortage of the paranormal from one part of the island to the other. From women in white to aliens and ghost ships, if you can imagine it, then it's probably been seen or spoken about here. About 8 years ago, myself and a friend and my ex-wife all headed to a friend's uncle's cabin for a couple of nights. From where we started to where we ended up, it was roughly 10 to 12 hours apart as we walked to where the cabin was. Once we got to the trail that headed to the cabin, we had a bit of a rough go with it due to there being a lot of snow still on the ground. We got about 10 minutes into the trail and noticed a couple of sets of tracks deep in the snow. One set I recognized right away as being the tracks of a bull moose, and the other set I've never seen before. The unknown tracks came out of the tree line, slightly next to the moose tracks. The tracks that we saw were a fair bit bigger than our feet by a long shot. At the time, I wore a size 12 shoe, and my foot fit inside the tracks without touching either side. As the night settled in the woods, it was super quiet and unsettling, and the three of us were all a little uneasy and didn't know why. Myself and my friend had packed a couple of high-powered flashlights, and we went out on the deck of the cabin. We ended up shining the light down the trail, a little down from the deck, and we both noticed something standing behind the trees, about 20 to 30 feet from the deck. The tree was a full-grown pine and was fairly large on its own, and the figure that stood behind the tree was huge. I mentioned it to my friend subtly, and we tried not to show it much attention, and we walked back into the cabin. For the rest of the night, we noticed the figure weaving back and forth behind the trees, sometimes getting closer and then moving back again. We made my ex-wife aware of the situation, and for the rest of the night, myself and my friend took turns staying awake to keep watch. The next day, my friend decided that he wanted to leave and head back to his stepmother's house, and he packed up and left. Myself and my ex-wife stayed and just carried on with our day as if nothing had happened the night before. As it got dark again, the woods were still full of noise and life, and roughly around 8 p.m., everything got quiet again. It got really eerie and unnerving, and just as I was putting a kettle of water on the wood stove, there was a large bang on the side of the cabin that managed to shake the oil lamp that sat on the table. I stepped outside the door, and there was another loud bang on the side of the cabin. I called my friend to see if he could reach his uncle to see if anyone had come down the trail, knowing that this house was the last house just before the trail started. When he called me back, he told me that no one had gone on the trail, and I was told to call the local police for that area. I did so, and I was on the phone with the dispatch, and he asked me to look outside to see if I could see anything or anyone. I looked out the window and managed to watch a large figure walk past the railing of the deck. I had a hard time explaining to the officer that the figure was standing well above the railings. The railing from top to the ground was roughly 8 feet, and the top of the figure's head was at least 1.5 feet up over the railing. After a long chat with the officer, he agreed to send another officer to my location. While waiting for a call from the arriving officer, we could hear rocks and sticks hitting the cabin's walls and roof. Once the officer called, we were instructed to walk out on the trail to his cruiser. The walk was normally a 45-minute walk from the cabin to the end of the trail in the daytime. Being that it was night, I had a feeling that it would take longer. It didn't take us longer than 20 minutes to get out of the trail, but the whole way out, I could hear something walking through the trees about 20 feet behind us to our left. Once we got to the bottom of the trail, I was able to look up to where the trees started, where there was snow still, and in the moonlight, I could see a huge figure standing at the mouth of the trees for a brief second, and then it turned and walked back into the trees. To this day, I still believe that I had a Bigfoot encounter, and I have not returned to the cabin. I will have pictures of the tracks attached to this image. The first one will be just an image of the track with my foot next to it, and the second one will be of the tracks next to the moose track and my foot. For anybody listening that wants to see the tracks, I'll make sure that I post them in our forum. Our last story of the night comes from Gary. Gary's story is called Fatal Collision. Gary says, in early 2017, I was awakened from a deep sleep by the loudest of sounds, just before 1 a.m. on a weekday morning. My initial thought was that something had collided with my residence, or that perhaps one of the doors on my home had been kicked in. After springing from my bed, I searched the home for any signs of damage or entrance. I found neither. I dressed quickly and exited the house, wondering if my home had been struck by a small plane or passenger car. I reside in a gated community in South Florida, and my home is a stone's throw away from the perimeter of the development. Adjacent to the community fence is a dimly lit 2-lane road notorious for serious collisions. I noticed the lights of emergency vehicles and realized that the sound that woke me was likely a vehicular collision. At the time, I wrote for a local newspaper, and my first inclination was to go inside and retrieve my camera. As insensitive as that sounds, I would have unrestricted view of an accident through the bars of the community fence. Again, reporting is what I do, and this was my initial instinct. I walked to the fence. Although it was the wee hours of the morning, the flashing lights from law enforcement vehicles and ambulances lit the scene. It was horrific. 2 smaller sedans had collided head-on, and the damage was devastating. I stood alone in the dark, moving my lens along the bars of the fence. A helicopter arrived to provide transport to an area hospital. "They're dead, you know," I heard from somewhere to the left of me. I was startled, as I had been alone in a darkened edge of the property. I looked up to see a younger black man standing against the fence. The mention of his race will become relevant later on in my story. "I'm sorry to hear that," I responded. Once again, I placed my camera lens through the bars and began photographing the scene. "This is a dangerous road," I immediately added, and removed my eye from the camera. I looked to my left, and I was alone. The area that I stood in was open and grassy. There were no residential structures built there at the time. The community has since been completed. I looked around, a full 180 degrees, expecting to see this unknown male leaving the area. There was no one in sight. Additionally, standing on a vacant half-acre of land, there was insufficient time for anyone to have left without being seen. I was taken aback, but was more focused on the accident than on anything else. Still, I found myself looking back several times, trying to rationalize the speedy disappearance. I returned home and emailed the photos to one of our writers and returned to bed. The following morning, I woke to an email indicating that 3 black males suffered fatal injuries, 2 in one vehicle, 1 in another. Love the podcast. Keep up the great work. Gary. As we come to the end of another episode, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for listening and supporting the podcast. Until next time, I hope that you all have a safe and healthy week, and I'd like to say thank you to Anisha, Jordan, Trinity, Myra, Vanessa, Maddie, and Gary. If you believe that you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable, and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, you can contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. You may also visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember that no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. All of our contact information, as well as the sources that were referenced for today's episode, can be found in the show notes. You can also get involved with the podcast by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can find us at Paranormal Mysteries Podcast or on Twitter at ParaMysteryPod. And while you're there, please give us a follow. If you're wondering how you can support the podcast, you're doing it now just by listening, and we appreciate it. You can also help by subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends. If you're looking for additional ways to show your support, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries and become a patron. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are produced every week and are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.